The objective today is to prove the need for cybersecurity by finding an example within the last week. And really what this is this should be one of the first videos my cybersecurity students watch just to make sure they're in the right class. I think when you say cybersecurity, a lot of people are just going to jump to hacking, and they may think of some of the really fun, thrilling, exciting things they see in movies and television shows when in real life it's not going to be that exciting. So let's go over what cybersecurity is, basically define it. Let me show you this DOL or draw your attention to the DOL here. It says given a definition of cybersecurity, 100% of students will provide 3 out of 3 details supporting the need for cybersecurity experts. And of course, this may be one of the most fitting IB profiles, risk takers. This would be one of the profile attributes we see often in cybersecurity is dealing with risk takers or being a risk taker yourself. So the table of contents, first we'll talk about what the study of cybersecurity actually means, and then we'll talk about other motivations people have when they study cybersecurity. We'll talk about some of the punishments they can find themselves in if they use their knowledge inappropriately. And the last thing we'll talk about is there a big need for cybersecurity professionals in this day and age. Essentially, you'll tell me through a little mini research project. And I think at the end of the day, if you just take this class to learn how to better protect yourself and your family or your future family, then this class would totally be worth your time. So part of the study of cybersecurity is studying who the hackers are, what their motivations are, and then learning how to defend against vulnerabilities. Because there will always be vulnerabilities, nothing is perfect, and everyone makes mistakes. Now, the great news for you, if you're thinking about a position in cybersecurity, is the average pen tester salary right now is $71,000. What is a pen tester? Well, that's somebody who tries to penetrate your system or a company's system, and they get paid to break things, or at least find holes in things. In this class, we'll talk about hackathons and hopefully get into a few. And what often happens in a hackathon is you'll have a red team, these are the attackers, and a blue team, these are the defenders. And why do we do things like this in the education world or in academia? Well, because like in basketball, a great way to learn to defend is knowing how to attack in the first place. So the life of a cybersecurity expert can be great. United Airlines awarded 1 million frequent flyer miles for finding vulnerabilities in their software. So essentially that means if you receive this award, you could fly anywhere, anytime, probably for the rest of your life. Now notice I didn't say hacker. This term comes with a lot of baggage. Cracker was the original name of these creative types who look to gain access to unauthorized areas of a computer. A lot of times students are talking about hacking or tell me they've hacked something. If they're strictly talking about the definition of a hacker being someone who's somewhere where they're not supposed to be, well, that's not actually that impressive. I suppose it depends where. So students can be in the wrong classroom and they're not authorized to be there, not supposed to be there. That's nothing really fancy or impressive. But if you find yourself in an office in the NSA headquarters, that can get you some jail time. So maybe depending on the area would depend on the level of impressiveness. But I think this word hacker is one of the most often misused terms in the English language. Hacker and artificial intelligence. These two words are thrown around all the time without people really understanding what they mean. So let's break down hacker in these 3 types. You have a black hat hacker, a gray hat hacker, and a white hat hacker. These are basically bad guys, medium, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and then always good guys. And that's not to say you can't switch. You can be a black hat sometimes and a white hat other times, and maybe therefore that's how you get that definition of a gray hat. But with that said, I want you to make an inference. What type of hacker do you assume would get paid by companies to test for these vulnerabilities? Say you're a bank and you want to pay a hacker to see if they can break into your bank or break into somebody's account. What hat do you think they would be wearing? Well, if you're in this class, you're used to pausing so that you can actually write or type down your answer to these sync rate shares. But if you're not, there's not much suspense in this next slide. I feel like I tricked you. Basically, a red hat is a whole nother term, and red hat hackers are the ones who are basically paid security consultants. They offer their hacking or penetration testing as part of their services. So if you're getting paid as part of a contract, yes, you're a white hat hacker because you're doing something good. You have this contract, this agreement with a company, but often these guys get the term red hat. And one of the most famous Linux distributions is called Red Hat Linux. Now, there are two other terms you might want to be familiar with. The first is elite, or you'll see it spelled this way, elite hacker. And of course, you don't want to be called this next one a noob, as in newbie. Nor this last one, I should mention script kiddies is a very insulting thing to call somebody. Basically, these are the copy-paste hackers, the people without much of a brain. They're just trying to cause damage for some horrible reason, for some neurosis or low self-esteem reason. So now that you're familiar with the terms, let's talk about motivations, basically. Now, the FBI used this acronym MICE to describe espionage in America, basically saying if you're a spy from another country, you're likely doing it for either money, for ideology, like if you're a Russian spy, you're doing it because, well, back in the day at least, you're doing it because you believed in communism and that capitalism needed to go away. So ideology is a good one. Another one is for either compromise or coercion. Maybe somebody's forced to be a spy or their family is being threatened. Or the last one is simply ego. Your think, right, share here is of these four, which one do you think would be the most common or the most motivational in this day and age? Now, I read an article in Network World about a cybersecurity researcher named Max Kilger. So apparently he likes to get into the heads of computer criminals. He chats with these people at conferences and online, studies their behavior, and when they hack inside HoneyNet's decoy computers. Throughout his many years of research, he's developed a motivational profile he calls Mises. So he's saying that hackers, similar to spies, hackers do it for the money, the ego, entertainment, for some sort of cause. Now that one I can really get behind. And that one is similar to ideology, isn't it? But one of my favorite movies, Sneakers, was all about a hacker who originally hacked into rich organizations or rich corporations and took the money and gave it to good, positive organizations and charities. Sometimes these people are called hacktivists. And then the last cause to be a hacker might be the entrance into social groups and status. And that kind of goes into that low self-esteem thing I talked about earlier. I think if you're doing something for the benefit of others or to impress others, to have a group of friends, that's sad, but I know in this day and age, maybe with social media, people are seeming to find friendships harder to come by and harder to maintain. I'm no psychologist, so I don't want to talk too much about that motivation. I'm curious to hear from you, though, of these six, which is the most motivational to you personally to learn things about cybersecurity. Later this week, I'll set out a poll, at least in my class, and we'll see what the majority of you guys are saying. So here's a picture of a fun infograph of those motivations we talked about before. Apparently 51% of people out there, of hackers out there, maybe they're script kiddies, are just doing it for the fun. And I have to admit, though cybersecurity can be dry at times, I think it's very fun. So now that we talked about the rewards, let me mention some of the punishments. And the first case I want to talk about happened to a 14-year-old. So I'm saying here that this particularly hurts my heart because I know what it means to be young and dumb, to make mistakes. I think that's just part of being young. And even when you are young, being aware of that should really help you out in life. That way you don't make any of these big mistakes that you can't ever come back from. So anyways, I listened to this podcast called Darknet Diaries, and in the podcast, the journalist interviews a young man named Finn. And so when he was 14 years old, he hacked his principal's Twitter account. Essentially, he just guessed the password. So he got access to his principal's Twitter account. He posted trollish stuff, said a few curse words, nothing that seemed like super ridiculous. But because this was in the early days when judges didn't know much about hacking and people were extra sensitive about being violated in that way. I mean, if somebody breaks in your house, you're going to have a really uneasy feeling for a few days after. Whether they took stuff or not, you just feel violated and vulnerable. It's not a good feeling. That has happened to me before. But what hasn't happened is somebody has never broke into my accounts or guessed my passwords. I'm guessing it would be the same feeling. If you've ever had a friend who took your phone or took your laptop and started posting ridiculous things on social media, as long as they weren't too ridiculous, it might not have felt too bad. But if they started saying some really crazy things or just pretending to be you and saying things that are not true, you're going to feel real bad about that. So the point is, the district attorney here, they took 2 years to actually try him in the courts. So he didn't go through juvenile court. So by the time he's 16, he's in court for this crime he committed when he was 14. And the shocking thing is, so he pled guilty to this felony, and he was facing jail time if he didn't do all these things, including pay $1,300 in restitution. And he came from a family that didn't have much money anyway, so that was really hard on his mom. And in this podcast, his mom speaks about the situation too. So if you are a podcast listener, I highly suggest checking out these Darknet Diaries. It's a good one. So with that said, if you're in this class, we're going to study the CFAA. That's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. We're going to study that in depth. So at least you can't ever say I didn't warn you about these possible consequences. Sometimes I have students come up to me and say, what happens if I do this? I can never really answer what a consequence will be to a crime or to an action because we're in America. This is America. The judge and the district attorneys are in control. And when they're not, a jury of your peers is in control. So your future is up to them. My suggestion is don't even play with fire. Don't even risk doing something inappropriate. If you're going to be hired by a company, obviously you'll have a contract. And those terms should be spelled out plain and simple for you. But you'll learn more as we study that CFAA law, okay? So I mentioned this in the beginning. I like these hacker shows and movies just as much as the next guy, but it is not reality. Cybersecurity is really just built on IT knowledge. And I say with a twist here because the fun thing about cybersecurity is you get to use creativity. And I think the more creative you are, the more successful you'll be. So here's why I say cybersecurity is not as fun as a lot of you may think. Because we're doing math. You really need to know your binary and hexadecimal like the back of your hand. We're talking about networking. Have you ever picked up a networking book? They're just not the most exciting things in the world. I like them. I get through them. I needed to give myself a lot of time to get through them because I'm very curious how this whole system works. But part of knowing networking and passing some of these certs, which eventually will help you pass the security certifications, is knowing all these details about cables and all the specifications of the cables. You have to memorize these going into the test. For me, I'm not a fan of memorizations. The only way I memorize things is because I've done something with it or reflected on it. We'll talk about that later in your education, that you don't learn by doing. There's only one way to learn. You learn by reflecting. The next topic I found that has been really challenging to teach young people is programming. I always like to say you don't need to know how to write a program like an author might sit down and write a book, but you should know how to read a program. And when you get to the parts in the book that you don't understand or you see words you don't understand, you look them up in a dictionary, right? When you're reading a program and you get to a part or some keywords, functions you may not understand, you'll have to be resourceful and look up the meaning of those as well. And it's a process that takes time, and I see it in my students' eyes. They get bored with that process. They don't have what the Colorado Department of Education calls mental endurance. So in this class, at least, we'll talk a lot about programming. That way you can understand how reverse engineering works and understanding the security of programs. The next topic is algorithms. I don't think I let you in this class unless you took one of my other classes or you've taken a computer class where you've learned programming and you've learned algorithms, at least the definition of an algorithm. Another thing we're going to do a lot in this class is read law and policy. So do you like reading? And I personally am working on reading really boring policies, laws, technical documents. I'm putting these up on my channel. They're called Fun with Wikipedia, Fun with RFCs. I'm going to do a fun with the cybersecurity law, especially CFAA. But if you're in this class, we'll be doing a lot of reading. There's just no way around it. And the last thing, I shouldn't add this to the list of things that are boring because a lot of my students find it very fun, but encryption. Encryption can be frustrating, but I think there's no greater feeling in the world than when you decrypt something or you crack it. and you're like jumping up and down in class with joy because that was a challenging exercise you had just accomplished. So I'm not trying to deter you from taking this course. I just want to dispel any illusions you have. Again, we're doing a lot of building on top of routine IT knowledge. Let's say you grow up and you don't want a cybersecurity job, but maybe you want a job as a programmer or you want a job as a networking person. Like any of these other technical jobs will only be strengthened with your knowledge of cybersecurity. So it's still very much worth your time. And I thought I should post this. Maybe worst of all, you'll need to be comfortable with looking at something like this. This is called a live memory dump. We'll get more into this a little later. We're going to go to a website called Micro-Corruption. So if you just can't wait to start understanding what this means, you can go ahead and go there early. So after all that trash talk, why do I actually like this subject? Well, for me, it's all about creativity. I thrive in a creative environment. I am skeptical by nature. If you tell me something is the truth, I'm going to still double check. I'm not a fan of senseless rules or laws. I'm not a fan of dictators. I'm not a fan of people who seem to take pleasure in exerting control over others. The only reason to have control over others is for their benefit, for society's benefit as a whole. If I ask you to do something in class, I'm not doing that because I just want to feel like I'm your boss. I'm doing that because I'm asking you to do something that's for your benefit and for the benefit of other people in this learning environment. Not to mention you get to do cool stuff like this. Hardware hacking is super fun to me. Believe it or not, this is just simply a badge to one of these big cybersecurity conferences that Hackaday has. So to wrap up, there are other cybersecurity positions other than pen testing I talked about. You could also be a researcher. That seems really fun. Or a security architect for a company. Both of these pay really well as well. So I just wanted to finish with a sample of what I would consider a little boring, but most of you should already be familiar with this, data sizes and typical transfer rates. So here we go. At the end of this lesson, I'll talk about a 49 kilobit rat. Now, to understand why the K and B are lowercase, you should just know that in general, that's how prefixes work. Anything prefix that represents a million or less will be lowercase. Anything more is uppercase. And by the way, you'll see this MS for milliseconds a lot in my Linux class. So in addition to recognizing these uppercase, lowercase letters, bits are usually in reference to data transfer. So you say bits when you're talking about data traveling over the wires to other places from one network to another network. And then you use the word bytes when you're talking about like storage capacity, maybe the size of a file, maybe the size of a game. One of my favorite games of all time, Fallout 4, is famous for having a relatively small file size of 28 gigabytes. But at the end of the day, as we're looking at these data sizes and transfer rates, just know that you should be thinking critically, as in, even if the author misunderstands or misrepresents the number, you should be able to make a good inference or assumption of what they meant. So I just said 49 kilobit rat. 49 kilobits is pretty small. Now I thought I should take you to the Wikipedia article here to kind of prove what I was saying about if it's a million right here, a million or higher, it's going to have a uppercase letter. And I mean, these are small details that I don't think a lot of people will get hung up on. But also remember, I say Wikipedia is for adults, meaning you need to be able to be knowledgeable enough to know if you're being tricked or something. And of course, if you're young, you could still use Wikipedia, at least I think so. Just make sure you check your citations. So when I click this citation, it takes me to a document. It's an archive document, but it takes me to a document created by the Public Building Service, which is a U.S. General Service Administration document. So I think this Wikipedia article is pretty factual in what they're saying. Because a lowercase b is supposed to be for data transfer. It's supposed to be for bits, not bytes. Now when I click on the chart itself to find its citation, it takes me to another Wikipedia page, which isn't very helpful, right? You cite yourself by going to yourself. But anyways, I just kept following this rabbit hole down. So after clicking on the chart, it takes me to this page, and the first citation for this page takes me to an Encyclopedia Britannica article, which is ironic because I read this book called Wikinomics. And in this book, it says that the Wikipedia is more often correct than the Encyclopedia Britannica, meaning there's more typos and errors in something you pay for versus something you don't pay for, like Wikipedia. Again, the point is just read critically. Why would anybody try to trick us in terms of what we should use, capital K or lowercase k? What would they have to gain? What would we have to gain by arguing about that so much? And it's those logical reasons which tells me I should not worry about the first letter being capital or not. However, I really do think the second letter, the B, is important. For the sake of clarity, we don't have to agree. We should at least just be clear. Now later when I show you this little tongue-in-cheek chart, just take it with a grain of salt. I think this is just somebody having fun, but I did enjoy reading this chart. It says a capital K and capital B is a Kelly Boodle standard unit, which is 1012 bytes. If you go lower, a capital or a lowercase k and a lowercase b would be an Intel kilobyte. That right there tells me this chart is not really a factual chart. It's more of a joke, I believe. So here's our DOL. You're about to find out what I meant by the rat, because I'm going to give you the DOL, then I'm going to give you an example, okay? So your job is to go to one of these 3 websites, find something about security, find a threat, find a vulnerability, and using this definition, you're going to tell me what went wrong in the situation that you had found. Don't forget to cite your source so I could double check that you're reading that article correctly. So you got to do these things and turn them in to get credit for today's work. So here's my example. I found an article on ThreatPost. So here it is. It's written by Tara Seals. It's a great article. Not only does she provide a lot of terrific details, she actually responded to a question of mine. So I often use this username, Deltron. It's the name of one of my favorite music albums. So I said, hello, I have a question. What is stub size? Because that's the thing that's 49 kilobits. She replied to me and she said, a stub is a simple program responsible for decrypting the payload and executing it. And it's kilobytes. So you're correct about the capitalization. So if I go up here, I see that she actually changed it in her article. Man, I love the internet. Alright, so to do your DOL, just follow these directions and you can use my example here and make sure you put your citation in this type of format and you'll be good to go.